Byla jsem jen chůva, schovaná s alfinými štěňaty, zatímco se celá smečka připravovala na pářící obřad. Netušila jsem, že sám alfa král obřad opustil, jeho oči upřené na mě z důvodu, které jsem nedokázala pochopit, dokud neudělal nemyslitelné. Kapitola 1. Šepot ve zdech. Vůně teplého mléka a čistého prádla byla celým Kellyiným světem. Ulpívala na těžkých závěsech, usazovala se v plyšovém koberci a žila ve vzduchu, který dýchala. Tady, v královské dětské pokoji, byla v bezpečí. Tady byla neviditelná, duch s jemnýma rukama a tichým hlasem, zaplacený za to, aby byl zapomenut. Broukala si tichou, nemelodickou melodií a v náručí houpala nejmenší z alfiných štěňat. Malou liru s chomáčkem stříbrných vlasů a očima, které slibovaly, že budou stejně bouřlivé jako oči jejího otce. Štěně se konečně usadilo, z jejich drobných rtů unikl povzdech a Kelly ucítila v hrudi tu známou bolest, prázdnou touhu po něčem, o čem věděla, že to nikdy nemůže mít. Rodina, partner, místo, kam patří a které nebylo vymezeno 4 zdmi jejího otroctví. Tento pocit byl nebezpečnou rozmařilostí a tak ho potlačila, pohřbila hluboko pod vrstvou povinnosti. Protože povinnost byla jednoduchá a chtít byla cesta do zkázy. Věděla to lépe než kdokoliv jiný. Zpoza tlustých dubových dveří se linuly zvuky smečky připravující se na velkolepý obřad. Smích, cinkání sklenic, šustění jemného hedvábí. Dnes večer měl alfa, král Kalin, oficiálně zahájit hledání Aluny, královny království. Ta myšlenka jí poslala mrazení po zádech, fantomovou bolest z rány, která se nikdy úplně nezahojila. Opatrně uložila liru do její kolébky a malého vlčata schoulila do klubíčka spánku. Jejím úkolem bylo starat se o budoucnost smečky, i když jí bylo zakázáno být její součástí. Právě když se otočila, aby se podívala na Lea, Liřino dvojče, dveře dětského pokoje se bezhlesně otevřely. Lady tam stála, vidina ledové krásy v šatech barvy zimní oblohy. Její stříbrné vlasy byly spletené do složitého copu, diamanty se trzpitily jako jinovatka. Nedívala se na štěňata. Její pohled, ostrý a odmítavý, přejel po Kelly, na zlomek vteřiny se na ní zdržel, než ji odsunul jako součást nábytku. Šmouhu na jinak dokonalém pokoji. Ten pohled byl ten samý, který dostávala celý život. Pohled, který říkal, že je to poskvrněné. Pohled, který šeptal o hanbě jejich rodičů, hříchu, který byla nucena nosit jako rubáš. Arinirty se zúžily do linky znechucení, než se otočila a odešla. Dveře se s cvaknutím zavřely a za sebou zanechali ticho. Co vlastně moji rodiče udělali? Nikdo jí nikdy nerecekne celý příběh, jen to, že její zrada před desítkami let téměř roztrhala smečku. Byl to odkaz hanby a musela si ho nést sama. V důsledku toho se ocitla v situaci, kdy se čím dál více stahovala do svých úkolů, její pohyby se stávaly menšími, efektivnějšími a smazávaly veškeré stopy své přítomnosti. Narovnala si deky, složila náhradní ložní prádlo, myslí prostupovala vírem starých bolestí. Vzpomněla si na jiného muže, Beta, o kterém si myslela, že ho miluje. Jeho slova jako kameny hozené do srdce. Žádná alfa si nikdy nevybere dceru z rádce. Ši nahraditelná, Kelly. Vždycky budeš. Jeho ležérní krutost byla na její duši značkou, pravdou, kterou přijala už dávno. Smečka potřebovala silnou lunu, ušlechtilou ženu jako Lady All, nezlomenou omegu, jejíž samotná pokrevní linie byla kletbou. Nebyla nic víc než chůva. Zvuky z oslavy venku sílily. Vlna hluku a očekávání. Jásali svému králi. Čekali na svou novou královnu. Ostrý, pronikavý výkřik roztříštil ticho dětského pokoje a vytrhl Kelly z jejich temných myšlenek. Leo byl vzhůru, jeho malá tvářička se zrudla, pěsti sevřené úzkostí. Jeho velryby zesílily. Zoufalý, srdcervoucí zvuk, který odrážel strach v jejím vlastním duchu. Zvedla ho do náruče, jeho malé tělo se tráslo proti ní. Kolébala ho, utišovala ho, ale jeho pláč jen zesílil. Udělala tedy jedinou věc, kterou uměla. Začala zpívat. Byla to stará píseň, ukolébavka, kterou jí tlumeně zpívala její vlastní matka, melodie měsíčního svitu a zapomenuté magie. Slova z ní plynula, jemná a uklidňující, a obalovala zoufalé štěně jako teplá deka. Jeho pláč stichl a pak se utišil. Zíral na ní s rozšířenýma, tmavýma očima plnýma důvěry. Ztracená v okamžiku, v prostém klidu utěšování dítěte, si Kelly vůbec neuvědomovala, že její píseň, její tajná melodie není zachycena silnými zdmi dětského pokoje. Nesla se kamennými chodbami jako vlákno zvuku proplétající, se hlukem večírků a hledající neklidnou duši, kterou nikdy neměla najít. Kapitola 2. Melodie osudu. Poslední tón ukolébavky dozněl a zanechal za sebou hluboké ticho. Ticho v dětském pokoji se nyní zdálo jiné, těžší, jako by zadržovalo dech. Kelly pevně objala Lea, jeho teplo bylo malou útěchou proti chladu její vlastní osamělosti. Její píseň sice zapůsobila, ale klid, který přinášela, byl křehký, snadno se roztříštil. Stále slyšela vzdálený hukot oslavy, neustálou připomínku světa, který pozorovala ze stínů. Když ukládala spící štěně zpět do postýlky kolem dveří dětského pokoje, proběhly 2 služebné, jejíž ostré šepoty prořezávaly ticho. Viděl jsi ji? Lady Alara už vypadá jako královna, řekla jedna z jejich hlasů, sálala úcta. Alfa král by byl blázen, kdyby si ji dnes večer nevzal. Byli spolu už předtím výš, než ho změnila ta severní šarvátka. Druhá služebná stišila hlas. Tiše, o tom nikdo nemluví. Ale máš pravdu, její krevní linie je bezchybná, potřebuje silnou partnerku, aby uklidnil svého vlka. Říká se, že je od jeho návratu neklidný. Ta slova zasáhla Kelly jako drobné ostré kamínky, bezchybná krevní linie. Její vlastní se cítila jako nemoc. Skvrna, kterou nedokázala smít. Odvrátila se od dveří. Rukama automaticky uhlazovala vrásku na dece. Její soustředění se zúžilo na jednoduchý, opakující se úkol. Bylo to takhle lepší. Lepší neposlouchat, nedoufat, necítit, protože cítění vede jen k bolesti. Hlasy služebné slábly v chodbě, ale jejich slova se jí ozývala v mysli a mísila se s duchem odmítnutí Betty. Žádná alfa tě nikdy nebude chtít. Měl samozřejmě pravdu. Proč by se král, obzvláště král s neklidným vlkem, někdy 2krát podíval na někoho jako ona, na někoho, jehož jméno bylo synonymem pro hanbu. Navzdory její snaze ho potlačit, jí hlodal pocit nedostatečnosti. Byla přízrakem v tomto hradě její jedinou, účelem bylo být pečovatelkou, zástupcem, dokud jí štěňata už nebudou potřebovat. A co potom? Kam půjde? Otázkou byla děsivá bezedná propast, do které se odmítala podívat. Zabývala se úklidem hraček, které už byly úhledné. Její pohyby byly tichou vzpourou proti zmatku v jejím srdci. Patřila jsem do ticha s nevinnými. To muselo stačit. Prostě muselo stačit. Jakou jinou možnost měla? Dokáže člověk skutečně utéct před hříchy svých rodičů? Náhlá změna atmosféry ji stuhla, ruka se jí vznášela nad malým dřevěným vlkem. Vzdálený hluk z velké haly jakoby utichl, stlumil se v nicotu. Vzduch na chodbě před dětským pokojem zhoustl, stěžkl neviditelným tlakem. Měla pocit, jako by svět přestal dýčat. 2 štěňata ve svých kolébkách se ve stejnou chvíli pochnula, neplakala, ale cítila to. V místnosti se zablesklo prvotní vědomí. Starověký instinkt, o kterém nevěděla, že ho má, jí zježil chloupky na pažích. Někdo přicházel. Tato přítomnost se vůbec nepodobala prchavé aroganci Lady Ery ani spěšným krokům. Personál. Tohle bylo ohromné. Síla přírody pohybující se hradem. Dveře dětského pokoje se tentokrát s vzáním otevřely pomalu. Záměrný zvuk se ozýval v náhlém ohlušujícím tichu. Kellyino srdce vyskočilo do krku a bušilo jí v zběsilém rytmu do žeber. Očekávala stráž, možná jednoho ze starších. Pomalu se otočila, tělo stuhlé strachem, který nedokázala pojmenovat. Ve dveřích stála mohutná postava, která blokovala světlo z haly. Byl obrovský, ramena měl tak široká, že se zdálo, že vyplňují celou postavu. Nedokázala rozeznat jeho tvář, jen naprostou ohromující sílu, která se z něj valila ve vlnách. Byla to hmatatelná věc, drtivá tíha, která stěžovala dýchání. Pak to uslyšela tyčí dunivý zvuk, který vibroval podlahovými prkny. Nebylo to slovo, bylo to vrčení a nevycházelo od štěňat. Kapitola 3. Zářící popel. Vyšel ze stínů do měkkého světla lamp dětského pokoje. Čas se zdál být deformovaný, natahující se a zpomalující, jak se Kellyina mysl snažila zpracovat pohled na něj. Alfa král. Byl větší, než si kdy dokázala představit, stvoření syrové, neskrotné síly vtěsnané do mužské podoby. Jeho černá tunika byla u krku rozepnutá, což ostře kontrastovalo s formálním oděvem, který dnes večer nosili všichni ostatní, a jeho tmavé vlasy byly lehce rozcuchané, jako by si jimi frustrovaně prohrábl ruce. Nevypadal jako král na obřadu. Vypadal jako predátor na lovu, ale byly to jeho oči, které ji uchvátily, které jí ukradly vzduch z plic. Měly podivné, fascinující světlo, jako žnoucí popel dohasínajícího ohně a upírali se na ní s děsivou intenzitou. Projel jí strach, chladný a ostrý. V jeho přítomnosti se cítila jako myš zachycená pohledem jestřába. Její výcvik, její život v otroctví se projevil. Udělala hlubokou pukrlu, sklonila hlavu a upřela zrak na podlahové prkna. Nedívej se na mě. Nedívej se na mě. Prosím, prostě odejděte. Snažila se zmenšit, složit se do sebe, dokud se z ní nestal pouhý zmačkaný stín na podlaze. Být si všiml někoho z vysoké hodnosti bylo riziko. Být si všiml alfa krále. To byl rozsudek smrti. On byl ten, kdo dodržoval zákony smečky, ty samé zákony, které ji držely v odloučení. V návaznosti na tento počáteční instinkt se zdálo, že v napjatém tichu uběhla věčnost. Jediným zvukem bylo zběsilé bubnování jejího vlastního srdce. Nemluvil, nehýbal se, jen ji pozoroval. Cítila jeho pohled na své skloněné hlavě, fyzickou tíhu, která na ní tlačila. Vzduch praskal energií, jakou nikdy předtím nezažila. Divoké prvotní bzučení, z něhož jí bolely zuby. Byl to jeho vlk. Cítila, jak se mu víří těsně pod kůží. Něco násilného, něklidného, co se soustředilo výhradně na ní. Proč? Proč tady je? Udělala něco špatně. Byl tu proto, aby ji vyhnal za nějaký neznámý přestupek. Kelly jeho hlas. Nebyl hlasitý, ale naplnil celou místnost. Tiché, hrdelní zamručení, které jí vibrovalo hluboko v kostech. Nebyl to ten. Hlas krále oslovujícího sluhu. Byl to majetnický hlas. Byl to nárok. Jediné slovo ji vytrhlo z klidu. Vzhlédla neschopná se zastavit. Jeho oči teď hořely, zlatavé uhlíky plápolaly emocí, kterou nedokázala pochopit. Vypadalo to jako zoufalství. Vypadalo to jako hlad. Hruď se mu zvedala a klesala v hlubokém, kontrolovaném rytmu, ale sval v čelistí se mu škubal a prozrazoval bouři zuřící v něm. Udělal krok vpřed a pak další, překonal vzdálenost mezi nimi s plynulým grácií lovce. Spurt ustoupila, každý instinkt jí křičel k útěku. Zády narazila do masivního dreva liriziny postýlky, okraj se jí zaryl do páteře. V pasti stál nad ní hora svalů, zuřivosti a něčeho dalšího něčeho, co se nebezpečně podobalo útě. Natáhl ruku velkou a mozolnatou a ona sebou trhla v očekávání rány. Ale neudeřil ji. Nedotkl se její tváře ani vlasů. Jeho prsti sevřely její zápěstí, jeho stisk byl jako železo, nevyhnutelný. Přesto z jeho kůže vystřelil do její šokující záblesk horka, spalující teplo, které jí putovalo po paži a přímo k srdci. Nebolelo to, bylo to probuzení. Na dechberoucí okamžiky tam jen držel, palce hladily jemnou kůži na jejím zápěstí, jeho planoucí oči zkoumaly její tvář, jako by si pamatoval každý detail. Pak se beze slova otočil, bez námahy ji zvedl na nohy a táhl ji ke dveřím. Klopítala za ním, mysl měla prázdnou tabulku šoku a hrůzy. Když dorazili ke dveřím, zastavil se, naposledy ji přejel pohledem a zlaté světlo v jeho očích se rozhořelo v majetnické peklo. Z hrudi se mu vydralo zavrčení, jediné definitivní slovo, které se rozléhalo chodbou a navždy spečetilo její osud. Moje. Kapitola 4. Králův dekret. Slovo se rozléhalo. Moje. Nebylo to slovo, byla to cejch vypálený do vzduchu, do její samotné duše. Pak se svět rozmazal, Kalinův stisk na jejím zápěstí byl jako železné pouto a on ji táhl ji. Z tichého útočiště dětského pokoje do srdce bouře. Kamenná podlaha pod jejími tenkými pantoflemi byla studená a neúprosná. V ostrém kontrastu se spalujícím žárem vyzařujícím z jeho těla. Gobelíny zobrazující starověké bitvy a legendární lovy se jí rozmazávaly před očima. Jejich tkané nitě byly v jejím panickém pohledu jako barevná skvrna. Jeho kroky byly těžké, rozvážné, zvuk osudu, o který nikdy neprosila, že se řítí vpřed. Její kroky byly zběsilé, klopítavé, zvuk vyděšeného tvora, který se snaží uniknout z klece, která už byla zamčená. Ne, to se nemůže dít. Je to omyl. Krutý, hrozný sen. Její prosté šedé chůviny šaty připomínaly pytlovinu. Znak jejího nízkého postavení, který všichni viděli. Byla vrabcem vtaženým do orlího hnízda. Vtrhly tyčícími se dveřmi velké síně. Zasáhla je vlna zvuků, hudby, smíchů, rozhovorů, jen aby v okamžiku utichla. 1000 rozhovorů se udusilo v tichu. 1000 párů očí se otočilo a upřelo se na ni. Místnost byla galaxií trzpitivých světla z mohutných lustrů, moře hedvábí a šperků a dokonale tvarované tváře. A každá jednotlivá tvář se obrátila k podívané na svého alfa krále, svého neskroceného vůdce, který držel za zápěstí vyděšenou chůvu s prostým výrazem, jako by byla válečnou kořistí. Vzduch houstl nevyslovenými otázkami, šokem, který se rychle změnil v nedůvěru a pak v opovržení. Kelly se chtěla sverknout, rozplynout se v nicotu pod tíhou jejich společného pohledu. Cítila jejich soud jako fyzickou ránu, jejich opovržení, 1000 drobných jehliček pronikajících do její kůže. Ale Calin nespomalil. Zdálo se, že si nevšiml oromeného ticha ani scházející hrůzy ve tvářích své smečky. Pohyboval se s jediným děsivým cílem a táhli rozdělujícím se davem. Šlechtici v parádních šatech se mu vytratili z cesty, jejich výrazy byly směsicí strachu a rozhořčení. Zastavil se až poté, co dorazili k vyvýšenému dejs v přední části síně, kde stály prázdné 2 zdobené trůny. Vytáhl ji po schodech nahoru, jeho přítomnost byla tak ohromná, že se zdálo, že je zastíní. V té samé místnosti. Zastavil se vedle alfa trůnu, mistrovského díla z vyřezávaného dubu a tmavé srsti a otočil se čelem k tiché smečce. A nepustil ji. Místo toho zvedl jejich spojené ruce vysoko, aby je všichni viděli. Král a sluha. Sálem se rozlehl ostrý a kolektivní výdech. Jeho hlas, když promluvil, nebyl měřeným tónem vládce. Byl to syrový, hrdelní zev vlka, který si nárokuje své teritorium. Dnes večer jste očekávali, že si vyberou lunu. Jeho pohled přejel davem, vyzýval a odváděl pozornost kohokoliv z nich. Očekávali jste volbu politiky, pokrevní linie, výhodnosti. Odmlčel se, ticho v sále bylo tak dokonalé, že Kelly slyšela zběsilý tlukot vlastního srdce. Pak jeho palčivý pohled k ní sklouzl a na vteřinu zuřivost v jeho očích změkla do něčeho, co nedokázala pojmenovat. Můj velk se rozhodl. Mé srdce a má duše si vybrali. Ohlédl se zpět na smečku a jeho hlas se stišil do smrtícího majetnického vrčení, které nenechávalo prostor pro hádku. Tahle žena je moje partnerka. Kapitola 5. Trnový trůn. Královo prohlášení prolomilo ticho a na jeho místě vybuchla jedovatá vlna šepotu. Chůva, její rodiče byli zrádci. Tohle je urážka smečky. Slova byla jako roj rozuřených voz, štípající a neúprosné. Kelly se trásla, její svět se nakláněl na své ose. Tohle bylo horší než noční můra, protože v noční můře se člověk nakonec probudí. Tohle bylo skutečné. Nepřátelství linoucí se z davu bylo fyzickou silou, která ji hrozila rozdrtit. Z tohoto nového úhlu pohledu její život v tichém otroctví skončil a nahradilo ho děsivé, nechtěné valení se uprostřed schylující bouře. Instinktivně se pokusila vytáhnout ruku z Calinova sevření, zoufalý, feudální pokus přerušit toto nemožné spojení, ale jeho prsty se sevřely neústupná kotva v bouři. Právě když se šepot začal měnit v řev nesouhlasu, z davu se vynořila postava. Lord Valerius, hlava rady starších, se stříbrnými vlasy lesklými jako koruna z mrazu, vystoupil vpřed, jeho tvář byla maskou chladného ovládaného vzteku. Alfa králi začal hlasem znějícím autoritou, jasnou výzvou Calinově hlasu. To nemůžeš myslet vážně, zákon je jasný, tradice je jasná. Luna musí pocházet z urozené krve, z vlčice, která dokáže smečku posílit, neoslabit odkazem hanby. Každé slovo bylo úmyslným řezem, jehož cílem bylo ji ponížit, připomenout všem skvrnu, kterou v sobě nesla. Hanba byla živoucí věc, svíjející se v jejich útrobách, horká a dusivá. Chtěla utéct, dokud jí plíce nehořely a svět nezmizel, ale Calinův stisky pevně držel. Calin zůstal naprosto nehybný, predátor, který pozoroval a čekal. Nechal slova Elerů viset ve vzduchu, svědectví o rozhořčení smečky. Nechal tíhu jejich nesouhlasu dolehnout na Kelína ramena a donutil jí cítit plný rozsah propasti, kterou právě vytvořil. Teprve když Valerias dořekla, se Calin konečně pohnul. Pomalu otočil hlavu a jeho zářící pohled přitiskl staršího na místo. V hrudi mu zavibrovalo tiché zavrčení, zvuk tak prvotní, že vyslal síní novou vlnu strachu. Zákon slouží smečce, zavrčel Kalin nebezpečně tichým hlasem. A moje družka posílí tuto smečku, protože je moje. Její odkaz je nyní i mým odkazem. Udělal hrozivý krok vpřed a stáhl s sebou Kelly. Zpochybňuj mou volbu, Valeriusi, a ty vyzveš mě. Hrozba byla nezaměnitelná. Postavit se jeho volbě byla zrada. Než stačil starší odpovědět, napětí prořízl další hlas, hladký jako hedvábí a ostrý jako sklo. Kalin. Lady Alá se vklouzla vpřed, její ledový klid ostře kontrastoval s královým syrovým vztekem. Její oči byly upřeny na Kalina, plné bolesti a vzteku, které se zdály mnohem osobnější než politické námitky rady. Po všech těch letech po všem s ní zhanobíš svůj vlastní trůn. Slova byla otráveným šípem naznačujícím sdílenou historii, porušené sliby. Nešlo jen o korunu. Pro Laru tohle byla hluboká osobní zrada. Dělá tohle láska, sráží se v něco tak nenávistného. Calin se na ně ani nepodíval. Jeho pozornost zůstala upřená na radu, jeho poselství jasné. Její pocity byly irelevantní. S posledním odmítavým pohledem na Valerias se rozhodl. Otočil se zády k radě a řekl celému ohromenému a vzpurnému šromáždění. V tomto jediném aktu si ji vybral před svým královstvím. Vybral si svou služebnou před svou povinností. A s rukou stále sevřenou kolem jejího zápěstí ji vytáhl z Deis a zanechal za sebou trnový trůn a smečku na pokraji vzpoury, odtáhl ji pryč od veřejné popravy jejího starého života a do děsivého soukromí svého vlastního. Kapitola 6. Vůně duše. Těžké dubové dveře královských komnat se s bouchnutím zavřely a zvuk se rozezněl s děsivou definitivností. Byli sami. Opulentní místnost, která měla být dechberoucí, připomínala klec. Mohutný kamenný kereb stál chladný a tičí. Tyčící se knihovny škrábaly o vysoké stropy a podlaha byla pokryta kožešinami tvorů, které Calin pravděpodobně sám ulovil. Bylo to doupě predátora a ona byla právě vtažena do jeho srdce. Konečně jí pustil zápěstí. Kůže byla rudá a brněla pod tlakem jeho severní, což byl jasný znak jeho nároku. Nedíval se na ni. Místo toho začal přecházet sem a tam s neklidnou, zdrženlivou násilností, která naplňovala obrovský prostor a způsobovala, že se zdal malý a dusivý. Byl vkem v kleci a ona byla uvězněna uvnitř s ním. Ticho se protahovalo, bylo husté a nesnesitelné. Konečně se jí z hrdla vydral tichý chvějící se hlásek. Byl její vlastní. Proč? Zašeptala sotva slyšitelně. Proč si to udělal? Musí to být chyba. Calin přestal přecházet a pomalu se k ní otočil. Syrová zuřivost z velké síně byla pryč, nahrazena něčím mnohem znepokojivějším. Zlatá záře v jeho očích stále byla, ale teď je zaplavila zoufalá, mučivá bolest. Poprvé spatřila trhlinu v brnění alfa krále. Spatřila zranitelnost, která odrážela hrůzu v jejím vlastním srdci. Není to chyba, řekl hlasem chraplavým emocí, kterou nedokázala zařadit. Zhluboka se roztreseně nadechl. 5 let od té severní šarvátky byl můj svět šedivý a tlumený. Neurčitě gestem ukázal na místnost. Moje vlčí smysly byly poškozené, sotva cítím svou vlastní smečku, jídlo chutná jako popel, svět jeml. Doznání bylo překvapivé, odhalena tajná slabost. To vysvětlovalo šepot služebných, neklidnou energii, kterou vyzařoval. Žil ve smyslovém vězení. Ale ty udělal krok blíž, jeho pohled byl intenzivní, neochvějný. Když si zpívala, bylo to, jako by slunce poprvé prorazilo mraky. Sledoval jsem zvuk a pak tvou vůni. Na okamžik zavřel oči, jako by si vychutnával vzpomínku. Je to jediná věc, kterou jasně cítím. Jasmín, měsíční svit a domov. Jsi jediná věc na tomto světě, která mi připadá skutečná. Jeho uvažování se nezrodilo z lásky ani osudu, ale ze zoufalé prvotní potřeby. Byla jeho lékem, jeho kotvou ve světě, který se rozplynul v nic. Odhalení bylo závratné, směs lítosti a děsivého pocitu povinnosti. Byl tohle její osud stát se nástrojem zlomeného krále, viděl v jejich očích konflikt, strach smíčaný se zmateností. Znovu se k ní vydal, jeho mohutná postava ji opřela o tvrdou ranu masivního mahagonového stolu. Naklonil se k ní, jeho žár a vůně, divoká směs borovice a ozonu ji obklopovali. Cítíš to taky, že? Zamumlal. Jeho hlas, tiché vrčení, jí vibrovalo sks na sks. Tahle tyč, tato jistota, to je pouto páru. Probudilo se to ve mně a vybralo si to tebe. Byl teď tak blízko, jeho rty jen pár centimetrů od jejího ucha. Byla v pasti jeho velikosti, jeho slov, této nemožnou reality. Prvotní část ní, omega, kterou tak hluboko pohřbila, rozpoznala v jeho slovech pravdu. Cítila mezi nimi přitažlivost, děsivé, nepopiratelné spojení. Ale její mysl, její zraněné srdce křičelo po úniku. Hlavou jí probleskla jediná zoufalá myšlenka. Odmítnutí. Byla to její jediná cesta ven. Jako by slyšel její tichou prosbu. Jeho tělo stuhlo. Do očí mu vnikl smrtící chlad. Naklonil se ještě blíž, jeho dech jí jako teplý závan přejel po kůži a po zádech jí přeběhl mráz. Jeho další slova nebyla žádostí ani prosbou. Byla to přísaha, děsivý, světoborný slib. Odmítni mě, zašeptal, zvuk byl hedvábnou hrozbou a já spálím tento svět na popel. Kapitola 7. Ráno v pozlacené kleci nepřišlo s jemným chvěním štěňat, ale se studeným, neosobním světlem slunečního paprsku protínajícího rozlehlou, neznámou komnatu. Kelly se probudila s výdechem, srdce jí bušilo v žebrech, topila se v moři hedvábných prostěradel a péřových polštářů, vůně levandule a starých peněz nahradila známou uklidňující vůni mléka a dětského pudru. Tohle nebyl její pokoj. Tohle byla klec, pozlacená a krásná, ale přesto klec. Kalinina hrozba z předchozí noci se ozývala v tichu, slib zničení, který jí ukradl spánek a zanechal jí syrovou. Odmítni mě a já spálím tento svět na popel. Nechal ji tady v srdci královského křídla, vězeňkyni svého zoufalého požadavku. Přežití. To byl teď její jediný cíl. Musela se naučit pravidla této děsivé nové reality, než jí celou pohltí. Později vešli bez klepání dva sluhové s pečlivě prázdnými tvářemi. Nesli náruče šatů v odstínech drahokamů, smaragdových, safírových, rubínových látek, které kdy viděla jen z dálky. Oblečení působilo jako kostým pro roli, kterou nevěděla, jak hrát. Služebné pracovaly mlčky, jejich pohyby byly efektivní, jejich oči se odmítaly setkat s jejími. Byl to nový druh neviditelnosti. Dříve byla přehlížena, protože byla nedůležitá. Teď se jí vyhýbali, protože byla skandálem, chodící, dýchací krizí v těle, obyčejné služebné, královnou bez spojenců, partnerkou bez lásky. Byla sama víc než kdykoliv předtím ve svém malém podkrovním pokoji. Zoufalá potřeba, prvotní touha ji táhla. Musela vidět štěňata. Jejich nevinné, důvěřivé tváře byly její jedinou kotvou v této bouři. S návalem odhodlání šla ke dveřím a natáhla ruku po chladné mosazné klice. Odpušťte mi, má paní. Zastavil jí zdvořilý, ale pevný jako železo. Královský strážce oděný ve stříbrno-černém oděvu Alfiny, osobní gardy stál přímo před jejími dveřmi. Nebyl tam, když usnula. Alfa král vydal výslovné rozkazy. Máte zůstat v těchto komnatách pro vaši vlastní bezpečnost. Titul má paní jí připadal jako krutý žert. Byla to zdvořilost prokazovaná vězni. Její poslední spojení se starým životem, její jediný zdroj útěchy bylo nyní zakázáno, protože to nařídil Kalin, protože byla jeho majetkem, který musel chránit. Nechte mě projít. Hlas byl hedvábným šepotem za strážcem. Objevila se paní, její přítomnost v teplé hodbě byla jako arktický závan. Panovačným mávnutím zápěstí propustila strážného a on se uklonil a bez otázek ustoupil stranou. Alarův pokračující vliv byl jasnou, nevyslovenou hrozbou. Vklouzla do Kellyina pokoje a její oči s majetekským výrazem přelétly po místnosti, než se zastavili na Kelly, trzpitící se chladným, dravým světlem. Užívám si hedvábí chůvo, zamručela a hlas jí stékal povýšeností. Nepohodlňuj se příliš. Jeho nové hračky ho docela rychle omrzí. Všichni ji obklíčili jako vlk odhadující svou kořist. Odhodí tě, zašeptala a její hlas se stišil do spikleneckého syčení. Stejně jako odhodil mě. Slova byla dokonale mířeným šípem zasahujícím samotný střed Kellyina nejhlubšího strachu. Ara se zastavila u dveří a otočila se, aby zasadila svůj poslední jedovatý úder. Zoufalství Alfy není totéž, co jeho oddanost, řekla a krutý úsměv jí skřivil dokonalé rty. Pamatuj si to. Dveře se s cvaknutím zavřely a Kelly zůstala sama s mrazivou ozvěnou svých slov. Zírala na svůj odraz v masivním zrcadle se stříbrným rámem. Vyděšená dívka hrající si na převlékání. Dočasná královna ve pozlacené kleci, která už čekala na den, kdy bude odhozena. Kapitola 8. Tajné srdce krále. Následující dny se rozplynuly v monotónní cyklus tichých jídel, prázdných hodin a neustálé, znepokojivé přítomnosti stráže před jejími dveřmi. Kelly žila ve stavu tichého zoufalství, duch strašící v opulentním vězení, které pro ní Calin vytvořil. Sám král byl přízrak vzdálená bouře, kterou cítila zuřit hradem během napjatých zazedání rady, ale která se k ní nikdy nepřiblížila. Byla jeho partnerkou, přesto on byl cizinec. Vzdálenost byla muka, ale možná si myslela, že je to také milosrdenství. Bylo snazší bát se nestvůry, než rozumět muži. Pak se jednoho večera, když soumrak zbarvil oblohu do odstínů pohmožděné fialové a jemné oranžové, objevil. Stál v jejich dveřích, jeho široká ramena vyplňovala rám, jeho výraz byl nečitelný. Prostě řekla, pojď se mnou. Srdce jí vyskočilo do krku, jako zběsilý pták bušící do žeber. Vedli tičími, klikatými chodbami, jeho těžké kroky byly v ostrém kontrastu s jejími vlastními váhavými kroky. Odešli z velkolepých veřejných prostor hradu, pryč z trůnního sálu a jeho soukromých komnat. Vedli ji zpátky na jediné místo, po kterém toužila, jediné místo, které se jí kdy zdálo jako domov, do dětského pokoje. Dva královští strážci, kteří tam byli umístěni od noci, kdy se udála jejich šance, byli pryč. Otevřel dveře a odhalil měkkou, lampami osvětlenou místnost a tam pokojně spali ve svých postýlkách Lyra a Leo. To nebyl rozkaz. Byla to nabídka příměří, zaplavila ji vlna úlevy tak silná, že se jí zatočila hlava. Nečekala na povolení. Prošla kolem něj, tichý výdech jí unikl z rtů, když překročila známý práh. Okamžitě šla k postýlkám, ruce se pohybovaly s instinktem zrozeným z lásky a praxe. Uchladila Lyrin stříbrný chomáč vlasů, upravila Leovi deku, její samotná přítomnost byla uklidňujícím balzámem. Štěně se pohnulo, jejich malé nosíky se škubaly, cítilo ji a pak se znovu usadilo do hlubokého, spokojeného spánku. Tohle bylo skutečné. Touhle byla v této místnosti. Nebyla skandálem ani pěšákem, byla jen Kelly. Cítila za sebou Calinovu přítomnost, tichou, ostražitou horu. Ek nejsou to jen Alfova štěňata, řekl tichým, drsným hlasem s emocemi, které nedokázal skrýt. Jsou to děti mého bratra, můj bratr Liam a jeho družka Aňa. Byli zavražděni před 6 měsíci. Doznání viselo ve vzduchu, těžké a ostré zármutkem. Skrytá vražda, neútok darebáka, jak tvrdila oficiální verze. Tohle bylo tajemství, které mohlo roztrhat království na kusy. To byl zdroj bolesti, kterou viděla v jeho očích, neklidné rozrušení jeho vlka. Nebyl jen králem břemenem koruny. Byl to muž zdrcený ztrátou, strážce bojující za ochranu posledních drahocenných kousků své rodiny. Svěřoval jí svou největší slabost, svou nejhlubší bolest. Kdo zabil jeho bratra a proč to bylo zatajováno? Otázky byly děsivou propastí, ale byly druhořadé oproti pohledu před ní. Zlomený král bdící nad svými osiřelými příbuznými. In that moment, the fear she held for him began to transform. shifting into something new, something dangerously close to empathy, a fierce protective instinct, not for the Alpha King, but for the grieving man rose within her. Hesitantly, she reached out and placed a hand on his forearm. The muscle beneath her palm was tense as solid rock, but he didn't pull away. "Caline," she whispered, using his name for the first time, "your secret is safe with me." In that quiet vow, everything changed. She was no longer just a mate taken by force. She was now a keeper of his secrets, a guardian of his heart, and she realized with a chilling certainty that to protect these innocent children, she would have to do more than just survive. She would have to fight. Chapter 9. The space between a fragile truce settled between them in the days that followed. A new, unspoken routine formed. In the evenings after the castle had quieted, Caline would retrieve her, and they would sit in the nursery together watching the pups sleep. Sometimes a servant would bring a bassinet to his cavernous chambers, and they would share a silent vigil by the fire. It was a strange, fractured imitation of domesticity, a pantomime of a family that wasn't real. Yet in those quiet hours, she began to see past the crown and the beast. She saw the exhaustion that carved lines around his eyes, the gentle way his large, calloused hand would instinctively stroke Leo's cheek, the deep, abiding grief that shadowed his face when he thought she wasn't looking. A dangerous warmth began to smolder in her chest, an emotion she refused to name. This growing intimacy, however, was shadowed by a rising tide of political strife. Caline was under constant assault from the Elder Council. She would hear the faint roar of his anger through the thick chamber doors. Lord Valerius's name a frequent sharp bark. They were using her. She knew her tainted blood was the weapon they wielded, to question his judgment, to undermine his authority. Consequently, Caline's protectiveness intensified, becoming a smothering blanket. He forbade her from leaving the royal wing, insisting it was for her own safety. But it only made her feel more like a prized possession to be guarded, not a partner to be trusted. The more he shut her out from the details of the council's plots, the more the fragile trust between them began to fray. He was sharing his heart, but he refused to share his burdens, leaving her to feel like one of them. The tension finally snapped one evening. He stormed into his chambers after a particularly vicious meeting, a silent black fury rolling off him in palpable waves. He paced before the fire, his movements tight, his jaw clenched. Seeing his distress, Kelly acted on an old instinct, a simple gesture of comfort from her former life. She prepared a cup of chamomile tea, its gentle scent filling the air, and brought it to him. "Caline," she said softly. He stopped, turning to face her. As he looked at her, at the simple offering in her hands, the rage in his eyes seemed to just dissolve. It was replaced by a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. He reached out, his hand closing over hers on the warm cup, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Kelly," he breathed, his voice thick with a desperate longing that made her knees weak. The air in the room grew heavy, crackling with an unspoken need that had been simmering between them for weeks. He gently took the cup from her, setting it aside with a soft click. He didn't release her hand. Instead, he used it to draw her closer until only inches of charged air separated them. The space between them vanished. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the world seemed to narrow to this single heart-topping moment. He leaned in, his scent of pine and wild ozone overwhelming her, his lips parting slightly. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. Just as his lips were about to touch hers, he flinched back as if he'd been burned. A look of furious self-loathing twisted his features. He released her hand, turning his back on her so quickly it felt like a slap. A low, guttural snarl escaped him, but it wasn't directed at her. It was aimed at himself. "Get out," he rasped, his voice a broken, jagged thing. The rejection was more painful than any insult could ever devise, more cutting than the scorn of the entire pack. She stood there frozen, her heart aching with a confusion and hurt so profound it stole her breath. The intimacy had been real. She was sure of it. But the wall he kept between them was just as real and far more powerful, and she was left reeling, realizing the greatest threat to her heart wasn't the plotting council or a jealous rival, but the tormented king who had claimed her soul, yet refused to let her in. Chapter 10. The spark of defiance. A suffocating tension had become the new normal. For weeks after the near kiss, Kaelin was a thundercloud on the horizon of her life, a distant, watchful and dangerous presence. The gilded cage had begun to feel smaller, the air thinner. Kelly, tired of watching the world through a pane of glass, finally found a sliver of courage. She did not ask. She stood before him one morning, her spine straight, and told him she was going to the castle gardens. After a long, silent battle of wills, he conceded with a curt nod, on the condition that his guards surround her. It was a compromise that still felt like a leash, but the promise of open sky was a balm she desperately needed. The gardens, however, were not the sanctuary she had hoped for. A group of nobles was gathered by the rose bushes, their laughter brittle and sharp. Among them was Lord Marius, one of Valerius's most arrogant allies, his face a permanent sneer. He saw them approach and made no move to leave, his presence a deliberate provocation. He didn't address Kelly directly. Instead, he let his gaze slide over her before turning to one of his companions, his voice carrying easily on the breeze. "It is a pity, is it not?" He drawled loud enough for all to hear, "that the pups of a true alpha like Liam are now being raised by that." The insult was exquisitely cruel, aimed not at her title or her bloodline, but at the one pure thing in her life, her love for the children. The old Kelly would have withered under his scorn, her shame a familiar cloak. But something different happened this time. Hearing him use her pups as a weapon to wound her, it didn't break her. It ignited a spark of defiance deep within her soul. She stopped, turning to face him fully. Kaelin tensed beside her, a low growl starting in his chest, but she subtly raised a hand, a silent request for him to wait. Her heart was hammering, but her voice, when it came, was calm and clear as a winter morning. "You are mistaken, my lord," she said, her eyes locking with his. The entire garden went silent. "The only pity here is that a noble title is wasted on a man who possesses neither the honor to respect his king's choice nor the basic decency to respect the memory of a fallen alpha and his beloved mate." She took a deliberate step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout. "Perhaps you have forgotten who their father was. I have not." She let the words hang in the air, a reminder of a secret she shared with the king, a veiled threat that she was not the ignorant, powerless nanny he thought she was. The arrogant sneer on Marius's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of shock and uncertainty. Before the humiliated lord could utter a response, Kaelin moved. He was a blur of dark fury, closing the distance in a single fluid stride. There was a choked gasp from Marius as Kaelin's hand shot out, grabbing the front of the lord's fine tunic and lifting him effortlessly from the ground. "You will not speak of my mate," Kaelin snarled, his voice a lethal rumble, his eyes blazing with golden fire. "You will not speak of my kin." He slammed Marius back against a stone archway, the impact cracking the ancient stone. "If you ever do so again, I will tear the tongue from your worthless throat." He dropped the sputtering, terrified noble to the ground in a heap. The message was brutally, unequivocally clear. The public humiliation was a warning, the violence a promise. Later that night, as a shaken but strangely emboldened Kelly walked the torchlit corridor back to her chambers, the lesson proved to have been learned. The whispers had stopped, but they had been replaced by something far more dangerous. A silent, black-fledged arrow suddenly thudded into the stone wall just inches from her head, its shaft quivering from the force of the impact. The game had changed. They were no longer trying to shame her. They were trying to kill her. Chapter 11. The Unlit Bond. The castle was now a fortress within a fortress. Guards patrolled every corridor, their faces grim, their silence a constant, heavy reminder of the arrow that had nearly ended her life. Kelly was alive, but she was more of a prisoner than ever. Kalin was a tempest of contained rage and suffocating guilt, his presence a constant vibrating energy that left no room for peace. The failed attempt on her life had frayed the last thread of their fragile truce, and it finally snapped. It happened in his chambers, the air thick with unspoken fear and resentment. "This is your fault," she finally cried out, the words tearing from her, raw and ragged. "This cage you keep me in. This protection. It does nothing. It only paints a bigger target on my back." His control stretched thin for weeks, shattered. "I am trying to keep you alive," he roared, his voice bouncing off the high stone ceilings. He swept a hand across a table, sending a silver pitcher and goblets crashing to the floor. "I am trying to hold on to the one thing in this grey, colourless world that matters." The argument was a wildfire consuming all the things they had never dared to say. All her fears, all his frustrations poured into the space between them, a torrent of pain and anger. It was in the heart of this inferno that he finally let the truth slip, a truth more devastating than any assassin's blade. "How am I supposed to protect you when the bond won't even ignite properly?" He bellowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body trembling with the force of his confession. "It isn't whole. It feels broken." He revealed the devastating secret he had been hiding. A true mating bond, he explained, was a roaring conduit of shared strength, of senses and feelings intertwined. It was a shield, a weapon, a sacred link. But theirs was just a flicker, a pale, weak spark, because his wolf, the part of him that was meant to complete the bond, was too damaged, too broken from whatever had happened in the north. He could send her. He could feel the pull, but the final crucial connection remained unlit. The words struck Kelly with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Ara's poisonous whisper echoed in her mind. An alpha's desperation is not the same as his devotion. It was true, all of it. He hadn't chosen her. He had grabbed for a cure, a medicine that was now failing. Her deepest wound, the belief that she was unworthy and replaceable, was ripped open, exposed, and bleeding. She was a failed remedy, a disgrace. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. She wanted it to end. She wanted to sever the faulty, broken wire that was causing them both so much agony. With tears streaming down her face, she walked toward him, her body moving on autopilot. Her mind was made up. This was the only mercy she could offer either of them. She looked into his blazing, tormented eyes, the words of rejection forming on her lips. A final destructive release. She began, her voice a broken whisper. But as she opened her mouth to speak the ancient binding words, she saw it. Beneath the rage, beneath the desperation, she saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. The great and terrible Alpha King was terrified, utterly, completely terrified of losing her. That single, unguarded flicker of his own broken heart stopped the word on her tongue. She couldn't say it, but the unspoken rejection now hung between them. A poison far deadlier than any arrow. A silence that threatened to consume them both. Chapter 12. A Touch of Moonlight. The silence that followed was a living entity, vast and suffocating. The rejection she hadn't spoken was louder than any shout, a final crack in the foundation of Kalin's shattered control. He stared at her, the terror in his eyes slowly being consumed by a wave of pure agony. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips, and he clutched his head, his powerful body starting to tremble. The emotional torment layered on top of the deep, festering wound in his spirit was too much. The dam inside him broke. A sickening crack echoed in the chamber as his bones began to shift, his form contorting in a grotesque, unnatural way. His roar of pain was no longer human, but a monstrous, bestial sound that ripped through the room. This wasn't the swift, controlled shift of a werewolf in command of his beast. This was a violent, agonizing unraveling, a creature of pure rage and torment, clawing its way to the surface. He was trapped between man and wolf, his eyes glowing with a mindless golden fury, and all of that pain was directed at her. The source of his hope, the source of his agony, The half-shifted monstrosity lunged. There was no time to run, no space to think. The room was filled with the sound of its snarls, the sight of its massive clawed hands reaching for her. In that heart-topping, world-ending second, something deep within her shifted. Fear was eclipsed by a strange, sudden calm. An instinct she never knew she possessed took over. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. As the beast descended upon her, she reached out. Her hand, small and pale against the raging tempest of his dark fur and shifting muscle, pressed flat against the center of his chest. And then it happened. A soft, silvery white light, cool and gentle as a moonbeam, flared from her palm. It wasn't a weapon of force or fire, but of profound peace. The ethereal glow sank into his body, a silent, soothing wave that met the raging inferno within him. The creature's enraged snarl faltered, stumbling into a whine of confusion. The violent spasms rocking his body ceased. The golden fury in his eyes dimmed, clearing like smoke, revealing the shocked human gaze of Kaelin beneath. The raging storm inside him, the restless beast that had tormented him for years, was silent. For the first time since she had met him, his wolf was utterly, completely at peace. He stumbled backward, the last of the monstrous shift receding, leaving him fully human, panting, and unsteady. He stared at her hand, then at his own chest, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. She looked down at her own palm, a tremor running through her. Where had that light come from? What had she just done? The moment of shared shock, of miraculous, terrifying discovery was shattered by a sharp, urgent knock on the chamber door. A guard burst in, his face pale. "My king, we've captured one of the assassins. He's alive." Kaelin, his expression a mask of conflicting emotions, tore his gaze from Kelly and strode out to deal with the new crisis. But as he left, Kelly saw a figure lingering in the shadows of the hallway, Lady Arara. Her face was a portrait of cold, calculating realization. She hadn't seen exactly what happened, but she had seen the flash of silvery light from under the door. She had seen the raw shock on Kaelin's face. She now knew with absolute certainty that the little nanny was not just a passing fancy or a desperate cure. She was something more, something powerful, and the look in Ara's eyes was a new, far more dangerous vow. She would find out what Kelly was, and she would destroy her for it. Chapter 13. The Queen's Gambit. In the quiet days that followed the night of the silver light, a new and unsettling dynamic took root between them. Kaelin now looked at her with a bewildering mixture of awe, confusion, and a fear that was almost reverence. He kept his distance, as if she were a celestial body he didn't dare get too close to, lest he be consumed. But Kelly knew hiding was no longer an option. That strange, dormant power within her, coupled with the open threat from his enemies, meant she could no longer afford to be a shadow. Survival required a new strategy. She found him as he was preparing for the morning's council meeting, the air in his antechamber thick with the scent of leather and his own tense energy. He expected her to wish him well and retreat. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and spoke two words that changed everything. "I'm coming." This was not the act of a frightened servant being dragged to her fate. This was a choice, a deliberate step into the heart of the fire. She was doing it because the pups deserved a future free from the shadows that haunted their guardian. She was doing it because she was tired of feeling like the cause of Kaelin's problems instead of his ally. And she was doing it for the frightened girl who had spent a lifetime believing she should be invisible. As they walked the grand corridor toward the council chambers, a palpable wave of shock rippled through the castle staff. They moved not as king and servant, but as a united front, his powerful strides matched by her own determined steps. She felt the stares, the mix of stunned disbelief from the servants, and the cold, undisguised hostility from the nobles they passed. Each glare was a test, and with every step, she refused to fail. When they entered the council chamber, the low hum of conversation ceased instantly. The air froze. Lord Valerius and the Halfosen other elders were seated around the massive stone table, their faces hardening into masks of cold fury at the sight of her. Callan strode to his place at the head of the table, the Alpha's throne, a fearsome construction of dark wood and wolf pelts. But instead of gesturing for her to stand behind him or in a corner like a proper attendant, he simply nodded to the empty space at his right hand. The seat was unadorned, but its position was symbolic, a place that had been empty for years, a place reserved for the Luna. The challenge was silent, yet it screamed across the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum beat of terror and exhilaration. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting for her to falter. She would not give them the satisfaction. With a steadying breath, Kelly walked across the stone floor, her steps echoing in the charged silence. She reached the spot beside the king, and instead of sitting, she simply stood, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She met the glacial glare of Lord Valerius, and for the first time she did not flinch. She was trembling, a fine tremor running through her entire body, but she held his gaze, her spine a rod of solid steel. This was her declaration. I am here. I am his mate, and I am not afraid of you. The council meeting proceeded, the words about trade routes and border patrols, a meaningless drone beneath the real silent battle being waged. When it was finally over, as the elders filed out, their robes swishing with indignation, she overheard Valerius's low, venomous whisper to another. She grows too bold. This cannot continue. The other elder's reply was a chilling promise. She must be dealt with before the coronation or all is lost. Her gambit had succeeded. They no longer saw her as a pawn. They saw her as a threat that had to be eliminated. Chapter 14. A Taste of Betrayal. An uneasy quiet settled over the castle in the following week, the kind of tense stillness that precedes a storm. Kelly, emboldened by her small victory, began to carve out a space for herself. She even thought she had found an ally. A young serving girl named Lena, with wide, innocent eyes and a gentle smile, was one of the few who didn't treat her like a pariah. Lena would bring her meals, sharing small tidbits of harmless gossip, her warmth a welcome balm in the cold, hostile environment. Kelly had begun to trust her, to see her as a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness. That trust would be her undoing. One evening, Lena brought her dinner tray as usual, but with it was a special goblet of dark-spiced wine. "A gift, my lady," she said, her smile as sweet as ever, to help with the nerves. Grateful for the simple act of kindness, Kelly accepted the drink, savoring its warmth as it slid down her throat. The effect was not immediate. At first, it was a pleasant heat that spread through her limbs, a welcome relaxation, but the warmth soon gave way to a creeping numbness. Her fingers felt heavy, her thoughts slow and sticky. When she tried to stand, her legs refused to cooperate, buckling beneath her. A cold dread washed over her as her vision began to blur at the edges, the vibrant colors of the room fading to a murky gray. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. She stumbled toward the door, a silent scream trapped in her throat, which felt as if it were closing up, strangling her from the inside out. Then the world went black. Kalin found her. The sound that ripped from his chest was not human. It was a roar of pure apocalyptic grief and rage, a sound that shook the very foundations of the castle. He bellowed for guards, for healers, his voice the sound of a world breaking apart. The court came running, drawn by the terrifying sound, only to be met with the sight of their king losing his war for control. Claws, long and black as obsidian, tore through the skin of his fingertips. His eyes blazed with the untamed fire of his wolf. The agony of seeing her dying on the floor shattered his sanity, and he turned on the onlookers. A whirlwind of destructive fury, a half-shifted beast on the verge of slaughtering every person in the room. As the darkness threatened to pull her under completely, Kelly saw the monster he had become in his grief for her, and in that terrifying, beautiful moment, she felt no fear. With the last ounce of her strength, she pushed herself forward, her hand reaching out to clutch his face, now contorted in a snarl of pain. His skin was hot, his cheek bristling with coarse fur. She pulled him down, her voice a choked, ragged whisper that was somehow louder than his rage. "Cain," she breathed, her touch a final, desperate anchor. "I'm not afraid of you." Her words, her touch, pierced the red haze of his fury. It was the only thing that could have stopped him. He froze, the monster in his eyes receding, replaced by the terrified man. With a sob that sounded like it was torn from his soul, he scooped her limp body into his arms, his form still trembling on the precipice of the beast, and roared for the royal healer. His love and his rage were now one, a terrifying, inseparable force. And the question of who had betrayed her was second only to whether she could be saved at all. Chapter 15. Trial by Fire. She survived. The royal healer's ancient knowledge combined with a strange, resilient life force within her that actively fought the poison pulled her back from the brink. She awoke weak but alive, the betrayal having burned away her last vestiges of fear and replaced them with a cold, hard resolve. The castle was in chaos. Lena, the sweet-faced servant, had vanished. Her disappearance, a clear confession of her guilt and her allegiance to the council. Cain, now consumed by a singular need to both avenge her and solidify her position beyond any doubt, made a desperate gamble. He invoked the lunar trials, a set of ancient, perilous rites of passage designed to prove a mate's worthiness to the pack and the gods themselves. It was a tradition that hadn't been used in centuries, and it was his final defiant move against his enemies. The first trial took place at dawn in the sacred grove, a circle of ancient moss-covered monoliths that pulsed with old magic. It was a trial of the spirit. Kelly had to walk a winding, ethereal path to retrieve a moonstone from the grove's heart, all while braving magical illusions designed to manifest her deepest fears and insecurities. Lord Valerius and the other elders were there to officiate, their faces impassive stone masks. All watched from the edge of the clearing, a smug, predatory smile on her lips, certain that the little nanny would be broken by her own demons. As Kelly stepped onto the path, the world around her shimmered and changed, the whispers of her past rejections and the faces of scornful nobles swirling around her like phantoms in the mist. She pushed through them, her focus narrowed on the glint of the moonstone ahead. But just as she neared her goal, the trial was shattered. A group of black-clad assassins swarmed into the sacred grove, their blades gleaming in the dawn light. This was the council's final desperate gambit to murder her during the trial, and claimed the sacred magic itself had rejected her. Chaos erupted as the royal guards clashed with the attackers. In the ensuing melee, one of the assassins broke free, his eyes landing on an easier, more strategic target. In a special pavilion set aside for the ceremony, Lyra and Leo lay in their bassinet. The killer saw his chance to wound the king in the deepest way possible. Kelly saw him too. Without a moment's hesitation, she abandoned the trial, her own safety forgotten. She launched herself forward, a desperate, protective instinct overriding everything else. She threw her body in front of the bassinet, shielding the pups with her own just as the assassin's dagger plunged downward. A searing white-hot pain exploded in her shoulder. But the pups were safe. Cain, having just felt another attacker, witnessed the entire act. He saw her bleed to protect his kin, his future, his heart. For him, the trial was over. She had proven her worth, not with magic, but with a love so fierce it defied death. As he roared and charged, the final assassin saw her own opportunity in the chaos. With Kelly wounded and Cain distracted, she stepped into the center of the grove, her voice ringing out with triumphant malice for all to hear. She bleeds with courage. I'll grant you that. But it is the courage of a traitor's whelp, she screamed, her words echoing off the ancient stones. Her blood is a poison. She is the daughter of Maris and Lorien, the very wolves who betrayed the last king and tried to sell this pack to our sworn enemies. Her moment of greatest heroism was instantly eclipsed by the public revelation of her deepest shame, her family's ultimate sin laid bare for the entire world to see. Chapter 16. Sins of the Father. The echo of Allah's accusation, daughter of Maris and Lorien, hung in the stunned silence of the sacred grove. The words were a death sentence. The sharp, throbbing pain in Kelly's shoulder was nothing, a distant fire compared to the inferno of shame and horror that consumed her. Now she could feel the very air shift. The pack members who had witnessed her brave act, who had seen her bleed for their future alphas, now stared at her with a dawning, sickening horror. The brief flicker of respect in their eyes was extinguished, replaced by the familiar, ugly glint of suspicion and hatred. In the space of a single breath, she had been transformed from a hero back into a curse. Her family's sin was a ghost that would haunt her forever. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of righteous fury, seized the moment. He strode into the center of the clearing, his powerful voice booming with authority, turning the pact's confusion into a weapon. "It all makes sense now," he declared, pointing a trembling accusatory finger at Kelly, who was still slumped against the bassinet, Kaelin, a furious wall at her back. "This is not the king's faded mate. This is a viper we welcomed into our midst. He didn't just condemn her parents, he twisted the events of the past few months into a sinister narrative. The king's strange obsession, the attacks on her life staged to make her seem a victim. It is all a lie, a venomous plot to finish the treason her parents began. The accusation was masterful in its cruelty, a poison that seeped into the ears of the already fearful pack. This was it, her absolute rock bottom, wounded, exposed, and now framed as the mastermind of a conspiracy she couldn't even comprehend. The faces in the crowd, once individuals, now blurred into a single monstrous entity of judgment. Their low, angry growls were a physical force pressing in on her, suffocating her. Her deepest, darkest fear, the core belief that she was a blight upon the world, screamed its victory in her mind. "See, you are not just unworthy, you are a poison." Kaelin held her tighter, his own snarl a defiant roar against the rising tide. But even he could not hold back the sea. "She stands accused of high treason," Valerius boomed, his voice resonating with finality. "By the ancient laws there is only one punishment. She must be executed." The demand for her death rippled through the onlookers, a chant of justice and traitor rising from the crowd. The royal guards who had just fought to protect her now looked uncertain, their loyalty split between their alpha king and the undeniable weight of pack law and tradition. Their spears, which had been pointed outward at the assassins, now seemed to be slowly turning inward, forming a tense, glittering cage. Kaelin scooped her into his arms, his movements radiating a furious, desperate defiance. He carried her from the grove, not as a conquering hero with his Luna, but as a cornered king retreating with his accused, traitorous mate. She buried her face in his chest, the scent of his fury, a strange comfort in the utter devastation of her world. She had been named a hero and a traitor in the same instant, and now the pack she had saved was begging for her blood. Chapter 17. Crown against heart. Her shoulder had been cleaned and bandaged by the royal healer. The physical wound a neat, searing line of pain. It was a tangible proof of her loyalty, a testament to her sacrifice, and yet it meant nothing. In the eyes of the pack, the scar she would carry was merely another mark of her deceit. Kaelin stayed with her in the chambers that had become her world, but he was no longer a king radiating power. He was a tormented man, pacing the length of the room like a caged lion, his helplessness a far more terrifying sight than his rage had ever been. The crown was a lead weight on his brow, his kingdom a thing he could no longer control. A royal messenger, a young wolf with a pale, frightened face, arrived with the news that sealed their fate. Lord Valerius, in his righteous fury, had successfully rallied the other noble houses. Their message was an ultimatum: deliver the traitor's daughter for judgment and execution, or they would secede. They would shatter the kingdom, plunging the pack into a bloody civil war, brother against brother, until the taint was purged. The nation Kaelin had sworn his life to protect, the people he loved, the legacy of his ancestors. It was all about to be torn apart because of her, because of his choice. The agony on his face was a sight she would never forget. He was being crushed between two impossible loves, his duty to his people, and the primal soul-deep command to protect his mate. Seeing him so broken, so utterly torn, awakened the ghost that lived inside her. The old familiar belief that she was a burden, a curse, a replaceable thing whose only value was in being erased. Her life was not worth the blood of a single pack member, let alone the destruction of an entire kingdom. Love, she realized in that devastating moment, was not about holding on. It was about letting go. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she went to him, her hands finding his, her touch a plea. "Let me go, Kaelin," she begged, her voice breaking on a sob. "Give me to them, please. Don't let the pack bleed for me. My life, it isn't worth it." It was the ultimate expression of her own brokenness, a desperate attempt to prove the terrible lie she had always believed about herself. He stared at her, his golden eyes a maelstrom of conflict. His every instinct as an alpha, as a male who had found his other half, screamed at him to protect her, to fulfill his promise to burn the world down for her. But the weight of the crown, the centuries of duty ingrained in his blood, demanded the sacrifice. It was a choice that would destroy him either way. As they stood locked in that terrible silent stalemate, a figure appeared in the doorway. All the guards had not stopped her. The council's power was now absolute. She looked at Kelly, not with triumph, but with a mask of soft, calculated pity that was far more cruel. "Oh, you poor naive thing," she whispered, her voice a venomous caress meant only for Kelly to hear. "Don't you see how this ends?" She glided closer, her gaze flickering to the tormented king. "He is an alpha. In the end, a true alpha always protects the pack. He will always choose the kingdom." She let the words sink in, a final devastating poison before turning and gliding away. Kaelin's tortured silence in the face of her plea felt like a confirmation. Ara was right. The choice was already made. Chapter 18. The Price of a Soul. The great hall was repurposed for a spectacle of judgment. Gone were the sounds of celebration, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Kelly stood on a raised wooden platform in the center of the vast room, facing the grim-faced council and the assembled masses of the pack. She felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her. She had accepted this. Her death would be her final act of love, the only way to mend the world she had helped to break. The wound in her shoulder HD, a dull throb that anchored her to the present moment. She was ready. Lord Valerius presided, his voice ringing with grim satisfaction as he listed the trumped-up charges. He spoke of her parents' betrayal in lurid detail, finally revealing the full twisted version of their crime, selling pack secrets, enabling an enemy ambush that had cost dozens of lives. He painted Kelly not as their innocent daughter, but as their patient, vengeful legacy. The evidence was nothing, whispers and shadows. But the pack, desperate for a scapegoat, drank it in. Just as Valerius raised his hand to pronounce the inevitable verdict of death, the great doors of the hall swung open. Kaelin entered, but this was not the king they knew. He wore no crown, no royal finery. He was dressed in simple black leather, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes held a terrifying, resolute calm. He did not go to the empty throne. He walked through the parted crowd, his steps slow and deliberate, until he reached the platform where she stood. He faced the council, his gaze sweeping over them, devoid of rage, filled only with a profound, bone-deep sorrow. "You demand a price for the sins of the past," he said, his voice quiet, but resonating with such power that it filled every corner of the hall. "You believe she is that price. You are wrong." He did not argue. He did not plead. He offered them a trade. He drew the ancient ceremonial dagger from the sheath at his belt and laid it on the platform between them. Then, in a move that sent a collective gasp of shock through the entire pack, he twisted the Alpha King's signet ring from his finger, the symbol of his power, the heart of the kingdom. "I am the price," he declared, his voice breaking with the weight of his own words. He placed the ring beside the dagger. "I will renounce my throne. I will abdicate my rule and surrender my power to this council." He looked at Valerius, his eyes burning with an unconditional love that was a weapon all its own. "I will give you my crown, my kingdom, my entire life in exchange for hers." The world stopped. This singular, impossible act shattered Kelly's entire understanding of her own worth. He was choosing her, not just over his own life, but over his sacred duty, his legacy, his very soul. He was proving in the most absolute way imaginable that she was not replaceable. The realization was a devastating, beautiful agony. She could not let him do this. She would scream her guilt. She would lunge for the dagger herself. She would do anything to stop him from paying this price. She opened her mouth to refuse, to sacrifice herself as she had always intended. At that exact moment, a single pure beam of white light lanced through a high window, illuminating the platform in an ethereal glow. The full moon was rising. A low, guttural sound of torment started deep in Callan's chest. It grew into a roar of heart-shattering agony as his body began to tremble violently. The strain of offering his own soul for hers, finally breaking the fragile hold he had on his damaged, tormented wolf. Chapter 19. Blood of the Moon. Callan's roar of agony was the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. He was breaking, shattering, under the impossible weight of his sacrifice. The moonlight a merciless spotlight on his torment. The pack, moments before a unified mob of judgment, was now a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. In that instant, watching him come undone for her, something inside Kelly shifted. The quiet, desperate wish to die, to save him, was burned away, replaced by a ferocious, undeniable need to live for him, to fight for him, to pull him back from the abyss he was willingly throwing himself into for her sake. The beam of moonlight streaming through the window didn't feel cold as it touched her skin, her bandaged shoulder. It felt like a jolt of life, a surge of impossible warmth that spread through her veins like a river of liquid starlight. The whispers about her parents, the architects of her lifelong shame, echoed in her mind. But the words were different now. They were no longer an accusation, but a question. What if the story you were told was a lie? What if her blood wasn't a poison, but a legacy of something else entirely? Something feared, something powerful. As Callan's body began to contort, the agonized shift threatening to consume him completely, she moved, ignoring the panicked shouts from the council and the gasps from the pack. She walked back onto the platform. She was no longer a victim awaiting judgment. She was a woman walking toward her destiny. She placed both her hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. This time it was not a flicker. It was a flood. A brilliant, blinding torrent of silver-white light erupted from her palms, pouring into his body. The light was cool, calming, and it carried the impossible scent of night-blooming jasmine and ancient sacred places. The entire hall gasped as one. The moonlight in the room seemed to bend to focus, channeling itself directly through her. With a surge of power came a dizzying flood of ancestral knowledge, images, and feelings that were not her own. She saw faces with her eyes, felt power in her hands, and she understood. She was not the descendant of traitors. Her bloodline was a rare, ancient, and sacred thing. They were moon healers, a line of wolves with the ability to soothe the savage beast, to mend the spirit, to channel the goddess's very essence. Her parents hadn't been traitors. They had been a threat to a dark power of the past, and they had been eliminated, their legacy twisted into a curse. The flaw she had carried her entire life, the source of all her pain, was never a flaw at all. It was her greatest strength. Her touch did more than just halt his agonizing transformation. The silver light sank deeper, finding the old festering wound on his soul, the damage from the northern skirmish, and it began to soothe the scarred spiritual tissue. The tormented rage in his eyes cleared, replaced by a dawning, blazing hope as he stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He was not just looking at his mate, he was looking at his salvation. Across the hall, Lord Valerius and the elders stared in abject horror. The weapon they had wielded against their king, the narrative of her tainted blood, had just been obliterated by a display of divine, miraculous power. The traitor they had condemned was, it seemed, touched by the goddess herself. And in the stunned, reverent silence, a new, terrifying question began to form. What have we done? Chapter 20. The blood, oath. The great hall was trapped in a state of stunned, absolute silence. The miracle had left them breathless. Kalin, his wolf steady and calm for the first time in 5 agonizing years, seized the advantage. He took Kelly's hand, his grip no longer a brand of ownership, but a gesture of profound partnership. He led her from the platform, his gaze daring anyone to challenge them now. For the first time, the council was silent. They were too shocked, too afraid of the divine power they had just witnessed to even speak. Back in the king's chambers, the world had been remade. He was no longer just her protector, he was her devote. He looked at her with an awe that humbled her. The great Alpha King brought to his knees, not by force, but by a grace he never knew existed. She in turn was filled with a confidence she had never known, a quiet strength that came from finally understanding her own worth. "My parents," she began, her voice clear and strong, telling him everything she had seen, everything she now knew. "They weren't traitors, Kalin. They were healers. I think someone in the old king's court feared their power, and so they were framed, destroyed. Together, they looked at the pieces of the puzzle, the council's desperate, vicious campaign against her. Lord Valerius's obsession with her tainted blood. It was all built on a foundation of lies, a convenient story used to control the pack and the throne for decades. But how could they prove it? How could they show the pack that her power was a blessing, not a curse? Kalin, his mind sharp and clear now that the static of his wounded wolf was gone, spoke of a legend, a dangerous, forgotten ritual. The blood oath, he said, his voice low and intense, a bonding ceremony performed under the light of the full moon before the entire pack. We would offer our blood, our spirits, our very souls to each other, and to the goddess. It is the ultimate right. If it succeeds, our bond will be absolute, a connection no one can ever deny. Your power will be sealed as a divine gift." He paused, his eyes serious. "But if it fails, it could shatter us both. Our spirits could be consumed." It was an all-or-nothing gambit, a leap of faith that would either save their kingdom or doom it completely. There was no other way. "We'll do it," Kelly said, her voice unwavering. Their love, her power, and his crown were now a single tangled thread. As they stood together, a new team forged in moonlight and revelation. The chamber door burst open. A royal guard, his face pale and bleeding from a cut on his cheek, stumbled in. "My king," he gasped, breathless. "Lord Valerius, he's made his move. He and his loyalists are storming the royal wing. The castle is breached. He's led assassins inside. The sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the snarls of fighting wolves erupted from the corridor. A sudden, violent reality crashing down upon them. Their sacred, hopeful plan had just collided with the council's final murderous act of desperation. The battle was no longer a matter of politics or rituals. It was here. It was now. And it was for their lives. Chapter 21. A Queen's First Battle. The heavy oak doors of the chamber splintered, exploding inward in a shower of debris. Assassins. Their faces grim masks of fanaticism poured into the room, blades held ready. They were the council's final bloody answer. But Kalin was ready. With a roar that was pure, untainted alpha power, he let his wolf take over. The shift was instantaneous. A breathtaking whirlwind of shadow and strength. Where the man had stood, a massive black wolf now stood in his place, his form larger and more powerful than she had ever seen him, his golden eyes blazing with the clear, cold light of a king at war. He was no longer a broken beast. He was magnificent. He met the assassin's charge like a tidal wave crashing against a rocky shore, a storm of black fur, flashing claws, and snapping teeth. The battle was a whirlwind of brutal, chaotic violence. Kalin was a force of nature, his every move a testament to the Alpha King he was always meant to be. He fought to protect his chambers, to protect the pups, to protect her. But there were too many of them. Their attacks coordinated, their purpose singular. They were trying to get past him to reach the true target of the council's hatred. The pups, awakened by the terrifying clash of the fight, began to wail from the small, protected alcove where they slept. Their cries of fear cut through the den of battle, straight into Kelly's heart. The last vestiges of the frightened, cowering nanny burned away in that instant, consumed by a fire far hotter. She was no longer a servant to be saved. She was a Luna, and this was her den. An assassin, quick and wiry, slipped past Kaelin's flank, his poisoned dagger raised, his eyes fixed on the sound of the crying infants. He saw them as leverage, as a weakness. He was wrong. Kelly moved without thinking. Her fear transmuted into a pure, primal ferocity. She grabbed the heavy, ornate chair she had been sitting in and swung it with a desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. The solid wood crashed against the assassin's side, sending him stumbling, his attack thwarted. She was not a trained warrior. She held no weapon, but she was a mother protecting her young. Her raw, courageous act gave Kalin the single moment he needed. He spun, his massive jaws closing around the attacker, ending the threat permanently. For that one brilliant moment, she had fought with him, a partner in battle. As the fight raged on, a desperate assassin made a final lunge, his poisoned blade slicing a deep gash along Kalin's flank. The king's wolf let out a pained yelp, but finished the last attacker before the toxin could take hold. As the final enemy fell, Kalin stumbled, his massive form wavering, a whimpering sound escaping his throat as the poison began its deadly work. He collapsed onto the floor, the great wolf suddenly vulnerable. Without a second of hesitation, Kelly was at his side. She pressed her hands to the bleeding, blackened wound, calling on the strange, silvery power within her. But it wasn't enough. The poison was too strong, too fast. Acting on an instinct deeper than thought, she did the unthinkable. She bit down hard on her own wrist, tearing the skin and pressed the bleeding wound against his. Her blood, the sacred blood of a moon healer, sizzled as it met his tainted flesh. The silver light flared, no longer just soothing, but aggressively cleansing, neutralizing the poison and beginning to knit the torn muscle back together. As the sounds of the wider battle raged on outside, she knelt on the floor of their ruined chambers, healing her fallen king with her own life force, proving her worth not to a council or a pack, but to him in the most visceral way imaginable. Chapter 22. Two souls, one fire. The aftermath of the battle was a ruin of splintered wood and fallen bodies, but through the chaos, a new fragile order was being born. Kalin, weak from the poisoned blade but whole in spirit, stood beside her. His wolf was a calm, steady presence within him, a quiet hum of power where a raging storm had once lived. They stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded not by enemies but by the stunned, wide-eyed survivors of the pack. They had seen her heal him. They had seen her fight for the pups. They had seen a miracle, and it had left them speechless. The full moon, high and perfect in the night sky, poured its silver light through the shattered stained glass windows, bathing the scene in a sacred glow. This was the moment. There would not be another. With a strength that seemed to flow from Kelly herself, Kalin addressed his people. His voice was raw but unwavering, echoing in the cavernous, silent hall. He told them of the council's decades of lies, of their plot to control the throne, of the true noble bloodline of the woman who stood beside him. Then he raised his voice, a king making his final binding declaration. The laws of men have failed us. The traditions of the past have been twisted into weapons. Tonight, we will not put our faith in the words of wolves, but in the will of the goddess herself. He looked at Kelly, his eyes filled with absolute trust. We will perform the blood oath here now, and let the moon be our witness and our judge. A collective gasp of fear and awe went through the pack. The blood oath was a myth, a legend, a ritual so dangerous no one had attempted it in 500 years. Kalin took the ceremonial dagger from a fallen guard's belt, the same blade he had once offered with his crown. He did not hesitate. He drew a sharp, clean line across his own palm, the dark blood welling instantly. Then, With a reverence that made her heart ache, he took her hand. His touch was infinitely gentle, as he made a matching cut on her soft palm. The sting was a distant thing, meaningless. He pressed their bleeding hands together, flesh to flesh, blood to blood. As their wounds met, the moonlight in the room seemed to coalesce, to focus into a single intense beam that engulfed them both. Kelly felt his soul touch hers, the raw, untamed power of the Alpha King, his unwavering devotion, his deep abiding love for his people, and she in turn opened her own spirit to him. She felt the last grey remnants of the wound from the northern skirmish, the spiritual fog that had plagued him for years, and she poured her silver light into it, cleansing the last of the shadows. In return, his strength flooded into her, a tidal wave of pure alpha power that did not consume her, but completed her. It washed away the last faded whispers of unworthiness, the final ghosts of her past, filling all the hollow places inside her with his unshakable belief in her. The weak, flickering spark that had connected them for months didn't just ignite, it erupted. It exploded into a roaring, transcendent inferno. Their souls intertwined, their thoughts and emotions bleeding into one another until they were no longer two separate beings, but two halves of a single perfect whole. A wave of pure divine energy radiated from their joined hands, a silent, powerful benediction that washed over every wolf in the hall. It was a feeling of profound peace, of absolute rightness, of a sacred balance restored, and in perfect, unrehearsed unison, every wolf in the great hall, noble guard and servant alike, sank to one knee, not for their king, but for their king and their queen. Chapter 23. The Kneeling King. The divine energy slowly receded, leaving behind a quiet so pure and sacred it felt like a prayer. The great hall was filled with a silent, humbling sight of the entire pack, kneeling in reverence. Kelly looked out at the sea of bowed heads, her heart a symphony of emotions too vast to name. The invisible nanny, the disgraced Omega, the traitor's whelp. All of those fragile, broken versions of herself were gone, burned away in the fire of the blood oath. She was Luna, and she was home. Kaelin gently unclasped their hands. She looked down to see that his palm and her own were completely healed, leaving behind only a thin, shimmering silver line on their skin, a permanent physical mark of their bonded souls. He turned to her, and the love shining in his golden eyes was so profound, so absolute, it was more brilliant than the moonlight itself. Then he did something that shattered 1,000 years of tradition, an act of devotion so radical it would be spoken of for generations. The Alpha King, Kaelin the Unbroken, the victor of 12 battles and the ruler of the strongest pack on the continent, slowly, deliberately sank to one knee before her, before his mate, before his queen. He took her hand, not with the possessive grip of a king, but with the gentle worship of a devoted subject. "Kelly," he said, his voice thick with emotion, yet strong enough for every wolf to hear. "You faced down my enemies, you healed my wolf, you saved my soul." His gaze was an oath, a vow more binding than any law. "My life, my crown, my heart, they were always yours. From the moment I heard your song, I was yours." This was the new order. Not a king who ruled over his mate, but a king who knelt before her, their strengths intertwined, their power a perfect, unbreakable circle. As if on cue, a small commotion came from the side of the hall. A trusted guard, his face beaming, gently guided 2 small figures forward. Lyra and Leo, no longer crying, no longer afraid. They toddled on unsteady legs across the stone floor. Their eyes fixed on the one person in the world who was their true north, they bypassed the kneeling king and went straight to Kelly, their small hands clinging to the fabric of her dress. They looked up at her, their faces filled with a pure, uncomplicated adoration that healed the last of her hidden scars. This was the only judgment, the only acceptance that had ever truly mattered. With a laugh that was half a sob, Kelly knelt down, mirroring her king, and scooped the 2 pups into her arms. Their small, warm bodies fit against her as if they were pieces of her own soul, their familiar scent a balm to her spirit. She looked from their trusting faces to her kneeling king, to her devoted pack. The hollow ache in her chest, the ghost she had carried since she was a child, was finally completely and irrevocably gone. This was her family. This was her pack. The kingdom was no longer a place of fear and secrets, but one forged in a love that had been tested by fire and blessed by the moon itself. She was home. Chapter 24. Always my queen. Weeks later, the great hall was unrecognizable. The scars of battle had been replaced by garlands of white moon flowers, their sweet, heady scent filling the air. Silver banners bearing the new sigil of a black wolf and a silver moon intertwined hung from the rafters. Today was not a trial or a battle. It was a celebration, a coronation, a promise of a new beginning. As Kelly stood at the back of the hall, she felt a tremor of nerves, but it was a joyful, exhilarating feeling, not the cold dread of her past. She was not afraid of being seen anymore. She was ready to be seen. The music began, a soft, beautiful melody that spoke of hope and renewal. She walked down the long aisle, her steps steady and sure. The entire pack was present, and as she passed, they looked at her, not with scorn or suspicion, but with a genuine, heartfelt reverence and love. Just ahead of her, Lyra and Leo toddled along, scattering moonflower petals with a joyous, clumsy abandon. They reached the days where Kaelin waited. The look on his face, the pure, undiluted happiness that lit him from within, made him seem younger, chasing away the last of the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He was not just a king, he was a man who was deeply, truly, and completely in love. He did not allow an elder to preside over the ceremony. This was too personal, too sacred. He took her hands in his touch, both a comfort and a thrill. A guard brought forward the Luna's crown on a velvet cushion. It was not a heavy, opulent thing of gold and jewels. It was a delicate, ethereal circlet of woven silver shaped like intertwined vines of the moonflower, a single perfect pearl resting in the center. Kaelin took the crown, holding it up for the pack to see. But before he placed it on her head, he spoke his final vow to her, to them, a testament to their entire journey. "The world saw you as a servant," he said, his voice ringing with a passion that captivated every soul in the hall. "They saw you as a nanny, a whisper in the walls, a shadow to be overlooked. They were blind." He looked directly into her eyes, then his soul laid bare for her and for all the world to see. His voice dropped, becoming an intimate promise meant only for her, yet heard by all. "I see you, Kelly. From the very first moment I heard your voice, my soul recognized yours." He smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression of pure joy. "You were never just the nanny. You were never a placeholder. In my heart, you were always my queen." With infinite tenderness, he gently placed the silver crown upon her head. It settled as if it were made for her, a cool, light weight of destiny. The pack erupted, not in a formal cheer, but in a joyous, unrestrained roar of love and celebration. Kaelin leaned in and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss filled with the promise of 1,000 tomorrows, a future they would build together. As they finally broke apart, he pulled her close, the pups now held securely in their arms, a perfect, complete family looking out at their united, hopeful kingdom. The invisible girl was gone forever, and in her place stood a beloved queen. Her worth no longer a question, but the unshakable foundation of a new world. Thank you so much for watching this video. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. If you enjoyed what you saw, we've got a whole library of other videos packed with more great content just like this, waiting for you on our channel. So why not dive into another one right now? And hey, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on our next upload, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We'd love to have you join our community and see you in the next video. Thanks again.